So this is a Sicha that we're doing. We're going to learn the Hebrew version of it. So it's the Hebrew translation of a Sicha that was originally said in Yiddish. The Sicha you can see is Parshas Mishpatim. But you can see it was said over several years. So the Sicha would have been said 1 year, and then another year, a similar Sicha says, they kind of like combined it all. And the translation that we have for it is from, there's something called Project Likkutei Sichos, which is the plan to learn all the Rebbe Sichos over a certain amount of time. So it's several years the cycle goes. They're in the middle of the first round of the cycle. And every week you learn 2 Sichos. So this came up a while ago and I flagged it because it's about Shanas/Kilayim, which Kilayim is the general term that's used for when 2 things are permitted individually, but they're not permitted when they're mixed together. Shanas is Kilayim because it's wool. You're allowed to wear wool. Linen, you're allowed to wear linen, but wool and linen together is forbidden. And then you'll see there's several examples of what falls under the general rules of Kilayim. The thing about Kilayim is that it's a chok. A chok is a law that we don't understand. We learned one time about the 3 different categories of mitzvot. Oh, we learned in the Hanukkah Mimer. There's mitzvahs that are Mishpatim, they're called. So Mishpatim, they call them civic law kind of, which are things that even if Torah hadn't commanded to us, we probably would have come up with it. Courts of justice and things like that, we probably would have thought of it. Don't steal, we probably would have thought about it. Obviously we do it because God said so, but Mishpatim is this category that we kind of get them at a basic level. Then you have the Eidos, which are testimonies. So that's observing Pesach and eating matzah on Pesach. That all falls under the same category. So maybe we wouldn't have come up with it on our own, but we understand what we're doing here. Shabbos is one of those. We're testifying. It's a testimony. And then you have the laws. The chukim are stuff that we totally don't understand. They translate as statutes. We don't even realize how many of them we actually observe. Kosher, we all keep it to an extent. We all know about it to an extent, and it's considered one of the chukim because I don't understand this. What all these dietary rules are. Why this and not this. Anyway, so I flagged it that we have to learn it because a certain somebody in a certain class, it's a mitzvah that we're safely allowed to talk about. No one feels guilty of talking about it because most of us, especially living in the region that we live in, we don't necessarily have to worry about mixing wool and linen together because A, we're either not wearing either of those materials. In this day and age, we just say most people are not wearing those materials. We're not at the class level to be worrying about it, but it actually is a real thing. You have, for example, men's suits. What if they do it for women's suits also? The woolen suits for men, a lot of times they'll put linen in the lapels to help it lay nicely. If you have that, you have to remove the linen. There's actually companies that do that. They'll check to see if there's linen there and then they can remove without ruining the suit. Kind of laughing about this thing about Shabbos, but it's real. It's something that someone really has to check. So if linen, you don't necessarily have to worry that they stuck wool in there somewhere. But if you have wool, you do have to check sometimes if they didn't put linen into it because that's actually forbidden to wear. I am warning you from the outset that we're going to have way too much information. We are definitely going to have way too much information. But the approach that we could take to this is that we'll see what the Torah says and then we'll see the volume of commentary that's on it. The idea of that is the Torah is telling us something and we think, oh, this is what it means. Then we'll see how much more there is to it than just the Torah dropping the line for us. We'll see the scientific method that goes into figuring this stuff out. And then you'll also see how commentaries build on each other. So just watch the process. And then we'll also learn some cool stuff along the way. Okay, I think that's everything you need to know about this Sicha. We can start. This was delivered Parshas Mishpatim, but it's actually from the Parshas Ki Teitzei, which is later on. So with that, let us begin with the reading. We're reading this in columns. We're starting with the text this time. It's going to be by sections. You see how there's a little aleph there? We'll do it according to the sections of the Sicha. Aleph first, and then we'll go through the text that's in aleph. So this first section is introducing essentially what our question is going to be. And what the question of the Sicha is, we have a prohibition against kilayim. Kilayim, which is the mixture of 2 things which are permitted that become forbidden when they're mixed. But we see that there are exceptions for the kilayim. For example, shatnez, you're not allowed to wear wool and linen mixed together. However, the kohanim, the priests in the temple, the clothing that they wore for service, there was a belt that was made out of wool and linen, the avnet. So that was an exception. It's not just an exception, but the Torah says this is how you make it. There's another exception. The other exception is tzitzis. Tzitzis is made out of wool, but then there's strings or linen, so you're wearing wool and linen together. The Torah tells you to wear the wool and linen together. So the interesting thing is that how come when it comes to shatnez, the clothing, we see exceptions, we don't see exceptions when it comes to other aspects of kilayim. What's another example of kilayim would be you're not supposed to plow with 2 different animals. So you can't plow with an ox and a donkey together. It has to be 2 oxen, 2 donkeys, etc. You can't mix them. A little bit of explanation why. There's not an exception for that. There's also an idea of kilayim when it comes to agriculture. That you're not supposed to sow 2 kinds of seeds together. It's even stricter when it comes to a vineyard. There's not an exception for that. This is part of where the prohibition against grafting comes in. You're not supposed to combine 2 different species. So we don't see an exception for that either. When I bring bikurim, why can my bikurim, which are the first fruits, maybe if I bring bikurim from my grafting, then that should be allowed. But only exceptions we see are when it comes to shatnez, specifically these clothings. We're seeing the verse that tells us about these kilayim, and then we're noticing the exception, and the question is, why is there this exception? To understand the exception, we're first going to have to go through a whole thing about what kilayim. The bulk of the Sicha is teaching us what's kilayim. Aleph, that's the first section. Tekef achar hatzivoy al isur shatnez, immediately after the command that has a prohibition on shatnez, lo silba shatnez tzemer pishtim yachta, they should not wear shatnez, which is wool and linen together. Nitzavina b'kasuv, gidilim taselecha al arba kanfos kususcha gomer. The possuk, the verse, commands that you should have twisted threads. Twisted threads you should make for yourself on the four corners of your garment, of the garments that you wear. It's talking about tzitzis, and the twisted threads would be made out of linen. Just a side note, technically, it would be any four-cornered garment would need tzitzis. Now, tzitzis is made as a separate garment you just wear with everything. But for example, if you see what a kapata looks like that the men wear, you'll see that one of the corners is rounded, so that it's not a four-cornered garment. That way, you don't have to put tzitzis on it. The closest of these two verses, as in juxtaposition, you have one after the other, the twisted threads you shall make, af min kalayim, that it should be even from kalayim. Usually is forbidden. Shakalayim hutter b'tzitzis, that kalayim have been permitted for tzitzis. So the fact that these two verses, one follows the other, shows us that actually for tzitzis you're allowed to wear kalayim, which is wool and linen together, because usually the tzitzis is made out of wool, and the thread, this twisted thread, made out of linen. In this same manner, in similar manner, we have seen that there's also permissibility, there's allowance for kalayim when it comes to the clothing of the Kohen, of the priests. That one of the garments that the priests wore, the Kohanim wore in their service in the Beis HaMikdash, one of them was called the avnet. There were specific clothing that they wore for their service. It's very specific, the rules of the clothing, etc. So one of them is called the avnet. The avnet was a belt. Shai Asar Shatnes, it was made out of shatnes. This belt was made out of wool and linen together. First, we're seeing that there's a prohibition against wearing shatnes, as in wearing wool and linen together in clothing. And yet, right afterwards, we're seeing that there's actually, the exception is given to us by way of a mitzvah, that for tzitzis, and also, by the way, for the clothing of the Kohanim, it's actually permitted and mandated that the tzitzis is going to be made out of kalayim, and the belt of the Kohanim, the belt of the priest, was going to be made out of shatnes. B'tzarach lavim, we need to understand, and we got questions on this. Gimel mine kalayim yeshnam. There's three kinds of kalayim. Kalayim, as we said, are the mixtures. That separately, these things are permitted, but when you mix them together, they're prohibited. Doesn't necessarily make sense. If they're separately, what's the big deal if I put them together? B'karkar, b'vehema, b'gadim, in the ground, in animals, and in clothing. So there's three categories of kalayim, of the forbidden mixtures. The verse here is going to count them out in one continuum. It's giving us all of them together. Lo scissor karmacha kalayim gamer, lo sachar b'shar v'chamar yachdav, lo silbash shatnes gamer. You shall not sow your vineyard with kalayim, so you shouldn't make a mixture of seeds, basically. You should not plow with an ox and a donkey together, and you should not wear shatnes, etc. We see this similar verse in Parshas Kedoshim. So what we just saw is from the Parshas Ki Teitzei. There's another verse that also prohibits against kalayim. That's in Parshas Kedoshim. It's worded a little bit differently. That your animals, you shouldn't mate them in a mixture, as in don't crossbreed. Your field should not be sown with a mixture of seeds. So you can't just be taking random handfuls of seeds and just tossing them out. Each thing has to be planted according to its kind. And a clothing, a mixture of shatnes should not go upon you, as in don't wear shatnes. And if so, my tama, why is the Torah given permission for wearing kalayim when it comes to the service of the Beis HaMikdash, of a mitzvah tzitzis, and also the mitzvah of tzitzis? So we see that the exception has been made for these two types of clothing. Which is not the case, this is not so for the other two kinds of kalayim. When it comes to animals, when it comes to land, when it comes to the ground, as in agriculturally, so not for plowing, not for crossbreeding, and not for sowing in your field, in your vineyard. We find no exemption is made for a mitzvah or for service of the Beis HaMikdash and similar things. Grafting, for example, would kind of fall under this thing of kalayim. So if I graft a new fruit, why can't I bring that up as a carbon to God? Why can't I make a mule? Why can't I breed an ox and a donkey together? I'll get a mule, but then I'll donate the mule to the Beis HaMikdash. They can use it for transporting stuff. So why is it only when it comes to clothing there's an exemption, but not when it comes to other things? Not when it comes to the field, when it comes to sowing, and not when it comes to mating the animals. We will not find out the answer necessarily next time, because first we'll go through all the texts that are referenced here. The whole Sicha is going to be addressing the answer to this.